With the Governor's Music Ensemble, Colonial Williamsburg's own Baroque performing ensemble. We have Jennifer Edenborn on Baroque Violin, Brady Lanier on Viola De Gamba, Danny Corneliuson on harpsichord, Carol Stedman is singing soprano, and I am Amy Miller playing Baroque Flute for you today. In March each year, in honor of Women's History Month, we typically give a program at the Raleigh Tavern Apollo Room entitled Women in Early Music. Today, for this broadcast, Jenny, Carol, and I will be bringing 3 of those historic figures to you in a 30 minutes presentation, and we will leave 15 minutes after that to answer your questions. And please feel free to go ahead and submit your questions as you think of them. And now I'll turn it over to Jenny.
Thank you, Amy. Well, it's interesting to think about trades as they have to do with music in the 18th century. As a musician, with a trade in music, you could be a composer, you could be a music teacher, you could be a person who published his or her own music, and of course a performer in various ways. Our first example of a woman in music is Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre, and she was all of these things, and she performed and wrote on a par with the most celebrated men of her time. She lived in Paris from the 1760s until 1729. Some accounts list her birthday as March 17th, 1665. So perhaps tomorrow is her birthday. It's possible, an anniversary of her birth. Elisabeth was born into a musical family, and her father was a master harpsichord builder, and her grandfather as well. And her father believed in educating his sons and his daughters equally, which is not terribly usual at that time. So Elisabeth learned keyboard from her father, and she performed at Versailles for Louis XIV at the age of 5, and was thereafter celebrated as a child prodigy in her early years. And she was written about in a Parisian music journal in the 1670s as being the marvel of our century. And she was age 10. She published her first book of harpsichord pieces at age 20, and she was the first woman to compose an opera and have it produced. She wrote her first set of violin sonatas, published them in 1707, and they are very beautiful writing for the violin and the harpsichord. And they also are unique pieces in that they have a part that's separately set aside for the Viola Da Gamba, which was a very popular instrument in the French court at the time. So we're going to play one little piece of one of these sonatas. It's from a movement called an Aria Movement, so just one movement from Sonata Number 1 in D minor by Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre.
Hello, I am the previously off-camera soprano Carol Stedman. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the composer of the next piece. A little bit of background. Male musicians sometimes collaborated with female musicians pretty much in order to use the novelty of a woman in the arts to draw attention to their works. One of these was a Monsieur Fleury in Paris. He is the librettist of our next piece, which is from the opera Les Genies ou les Caracteres de l'amour. And he wrote of its composer, Mademoiselle Duval, quote, "I have brought to the stage a new muse who sets this opera to music. The fair sex will at least be grateful to me for presenting her, and she deserves your support and the public's indulgence," end quote. Well, unfortunately for Monsieur Fleury, critics hated the libretto, but they loved the music. Les Genies premiered on October 18th, 1736, making it only the second opera composed by a woman to be performed in France, the first being, as we just learned, by Elisabeth Jacquet de la Guerre. And all we know about the composer, we know from the published edition of the works. I think we have an image of the title page from that. We don't know Mademoiselle Duval's given name, even. We don't know when she died. We don't know if she composed any more music. But from the published edition and the dedication inside it, we know she was only 18 when the opera premiered, that she conducted and accompanied from the harpsichord, which was very common at the time. And in her dedication, she writes very modestly that, quote, "Her desire to please might take the place of real talent," end quote. But talent she had. Critics compared her harmonies to the great composer and theorist Jean-Philippe Rameau. This selection is from the opera's musical prologue. I think we have an image of the French opera house at the time. At this time, many scenes in French operas were very pastoral, and they had basically a series of dances punctuated with some little ariettes at the time. This is one of those. It's sung by Love himself, and he urges everyone to submit to him, since moments are fleeting, but love makes them pleasurable.
Well, Anna Bonn was a composer, harpsichordist, violist, Baroque flutist, and singer. She was born to Anna and Girolamo Bonn, who were members of an opera company that was recruited in 1732 to be in residence at the court in Petersburg for Her Imperial Highness Anna Ivanovna. And while Anna was born during their years working in Petersburg, it is thought that she was born in Italy, hence the designation of Di Venezia after her name. Now, they enrolled Anna in the Ospedale della Pietà in Venice. This was an orphanage for orphaned girls where they could get a well-rounded education and one of the best educations in music one could have gotten at the time. Anna wasn't an orphan, but they also took tuition-paying students. Anna was around the age of 4, so she entered as a child prodigy. Now, this was one of 4 orphanages in Italy where girls could go when they were orphaned. And these were well-renowned orphanages. Their texts came from composers all over Europe. Their teachers were all over Europe. Antonio Vivaldi and Johann Adolf Haas were among the composers employed by these hospitales. Now, the girls would also play for the churches attached to the orphanage for services, but these were also venues for blind competitions between the girls. And they had such a reputation that people would come from all over Europe to witness these blind competitions. The girls learned sight singing, ear training, and composition. They played in all-female orchestras, learning the winds, the strings, the brass, percussion, all instruments that were thought to be unladylike in England and in the colonies at the time. Diary entries from presidents, composers, royalty, and the likes of Charles Burney, the historian, all extolled their musical prowess. This is the environment in which Anna Bonn was educated. Now, she was at the Ospedale della Pietà for 12 years. She studied viola with Maestra di Viola Candida della Pietà, as well as harpsichord, composition, and flute and voice. And when she left the orphanage in 1755, she embarked on a long performing career with her parents. The first place that they all went to together was the court of the Margrave and Margravine of Bayreuth-Kulmbach. And if we could show a picture of the opera house, this is an example of what the Margrave and Margravine were willing to spend on the architecture in order to make this a cultural center. And they found themselves in quite a court, one of the greatest courts in Europe. Now, her father was the professor of architecture and perspective for the Academy of Fine Arts there, and her mother, Rosa, sang for the operas. Anna herself was holding the position of chamber music virtuosa, and she also received a scholarship from the Margrave. Now, both of them played the flute avidly. The Margrave had been able to study intermittently with Johann Joachim Quantz in 1733. He'd also studied with the eminent French composer and flutist Michel Blavet. So even though Anna felt that her main instrument was the harpsichord, her first set of sonatas was for solo flute, Opus 1, 6 sonatas. She was able to publish these at the young age of about 16. And back then, it wasn't as easy as just taking your compositions to a publisher and saying, I want to publish these, you had to get permission from your local monarch. And if we could pull up the dedication page for her first set of sonatas, you'll see a very lengthy dedication to the Margrave for this work. And later, the next year, Anna composed a set of 6 sonatas for harpsichord, Opus 2, which she dedicated in honor of Princess Ernestine Augusta Sophia of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, who was a young princess living at the court of Bayreuth with Anna, was about her age. Unfortunately, Countess Wilhelmine of Prussia, who incidentally was the sister to Frederick the Great of Prussia, passed away. And the artists and cultural people at the court began to start looking for other places to work. 1759, Girolamo's position with the Academy of Fine Arts came to an end, and that same year, Anna published her set of 6 divertimenti for 2 flutes and continuo, Opus 3. And she dedicated these to Karl Theodor, Elector Palatinate of Bavaria in Mannheim. And he too was an avid flutist who was also gathering talent at his court. Anna may have been auditioning for a position in his court by dedicating them to him, and she may have included a movement of counterpoint fugue in these divertimenti to show off her compositional skills. But she ended up being with her parents, who reformed their opera company in 1760 and began traveling around and playing for operas, when in 1762, Prince Nicholas the Magnificent had them play for his installation as the ruler of the Esterhazy estate. Now, they did so well that he decided to keep them on permanently. Girolamo was a set designer, and Anna and her mother Rosa sang in the choir and were chamber musicians. They were paid extremely well, and her father Girolamo, we know, was at the court until his death in 1773. However, we can only trace Anna and her mother on the books through 1767. Anna is also credited with writing an opera aria entitled Astra Chelly. We don't know what opera this may have gone to or when she wrote it. Her style is a little bit later than Baroque composers, so towards the classical period. And it's very challenging music, especially if you're going to play it on the one-keyed flute. And I like to think that all of her exposure to Italian opera style, being with her parents, influenced her compositions as well. Now, anyone here in Virginia would have thought this highly unusual for a young lady to have a professional performing career in music. There weren't any wealthy artist donors for the New World. We had a little bit harder lifestyle here. So the lower and middle sort people, they were playing the less expensive instruments, maybe self-teaching themselves. They could also maybe buy a tutor at the post office here on Duke of Gloucester Street and teach themselves how to play. But they would have had scant time to practice and enjoy their music due to their lifestyles. It was members of the merchant and gentry classes who had the time and the money to put towards a musical education for their children. The young lady's musical education would not have been to prepare her for a career in music, but it would have been to make her presentable in polite society as someone that could draw a suitable husband and hopefully marry up in society. She wouldn't have played many of the instruments that were played at the Ospedale. They would have been playing piano, harpsichord, lap guitar, or singing. Now, Baroque flute and violin wouldn't have been among the instruments being taught, except for possibly one of the daughters of Robert Carter of Nominee Hall, Harriet, his fifth daughter, who is said to have played harpsichord and Baroque flute by Philip Fithian. After getting married, the lady of the house would have had very little time to practice the musical skills that she developed in youth, but she would have made sure that her daughter or daughters were well trained in music on the ladylike instruments. Well, I'm happy to say that today, young ladies in Williamsburg and all over the U.S. are able to pick whatever instruments they want to play and be in any type of ensemble they would like to play in, including the Colonial Williamsburg Fifes and Drums. They're majoring in music. They're going on to have recording careers. They're winning national and international competitions. They're faculty members in colleges and universities, and they're administrators and leaders in the field. And I like to think that Jacquet de la Guerre, Madame Duval, and Annabon had some small part in opening those doors for ladies of today. And I would like to play for you Anna's Sonata Number 1 for solo flute and continuo in 3 movements, Adagio, Allegro, and Presto. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's a taste of our Women in Early Music program that we give every March. Now, I'd like to invite Jenny and Carol back onto the set so that we can answer your questions.
Our viewers. So everyone enjoyed the concerts. Thank you so much for that. So our first question, I think, before we get maybe into the topic at hand too much, we had a question from Marlene, and I'm sure there are others with the same question. Tell us a little bit about your instruments and how they've changed over the years, or since the 18th century, in particular, Jenny and Amy. And then, Carol, maybe you could also talk about, obviously the voice is the same, but we use it maybe differently.
The 18th century.
No, my voice isn't an original instrument, no.
Well,
It is an original instrument. It's my original instrument.
You age so well. This is well, we could use the term Baroque violin to talk about an instrument, the violin, that to all appearances, at first glance, really just looks like a plain old violin, but it has undergone some changes since the earlier instruments that began to change in the late 18th century to create a more powerful sound, a louder sound, and an instrument that could withstand more pressure exerted on the bridge so that it could be tuned up higher. So when the violin was first made, no one used a chin rest, not until about 1820 or so. So there's not a chin rest on the instrument. You might have noticed that. The left hand supports the violin. It was held in a lot of different ways, under the chin, but also down more or over this way. A lot of people hold the Baroque style violin on this side of the tailpiece because it keeps it from slipping down. So that's a really popular way to hold it. The neck and fingerboard tend to be shorter and not standardized, so the length of the neck and the fingerboard could be longer or shorter, but generally shorter than the modern neck that was put on the violin. Was termed sometimes, in the 19th century, they said, oh, it's just an adjustment. But it changes the violin quite a bit. You remove the neck and the fingerboard, and you remove the scroll, this part, put the new neck and fingerboard on the instrument, and then reattach the scroll. So instruments that have been modernized will often have a graft mark there where you can see where the scroll is put on. So there are some differences. The bridges look a little different. They're not as standardized. The tailpiece is flat. The bow is generally shorter and lighter. Plain gut strings in general. But there are some differences between the so-called Baroque violin and our modern violin of today.
Well, as far as the flute goes, the Renaissance flute was just one long cylindrical tube. In 1695, the Hauteterre family in Paris reworked the flute, and they divided the flute into three pieces: the head joint, the body joint, and the foot joint. And in 1733, the middle joint was split in two, and this allowed for more accurate boring tools. And they also allowed for the finger holes to be placed closer together. Now, the Baroque flute was cylindro-conical. The head joint was still strictly cylindrical, but from the top of the body down to the end of the flute was conical, and this had the flattening effect. This also allowed the makers to put the holes closer together. Now, the flute was made out of various types of wood. Boxwood, like this flute, was the most popular, but the African blackwood grenadilla was also very, very popular. Lots of different types of woods were used. The French liked the porous woods. It gave them a sweeter sound. The German liked the harder woods. And it only had the one key at the time. This is D sharp, which is still on the flute today. And this model was popular throughout the 18th century, even though makers began to add keys to this instrument starting around mid-century, especially the London makers. And it has a sweeter sound than the modern flute, which is made of metal and was developed from the orchestral setting, where the idea is to project your sound to the back of a concert hall. These flutes were designed for small rooms, and your idea was not to try to project and get that edge or buzz to your sound. So it was a sweeter sound. The Baroque flute is not in tune with itself like the modern flute is, but that's part of its characteristic, that you have tendency notes, so you have to get them flat or sharp as you play, either by using alternate fingerings or by rolling in and out.
Anything about the voice?
Well, the vocal technique was, in terms of pedagogy, was remarkably similar to today. We think of early music singers versus opera singers, and it's a very different sound that comes out. But not unlike the violin, you modify your vocal production in order to make more sound, which is the sound that we think of from modern-day opera singers at the Metropolitan Opera or someplace like that. In the 18th century, they were beginning to discuss the larynx and the position that the larynx should be in. There's a term for the whole back of the mouth that I can't think of. Maybe one of our readers knows it. Remind me. But actually, in that sense, not much has changed. It's more the sensibility. It was very important to be able to sing fast, which usually means for a lighter tone. Vibrato was considered an ornament, which means that you could put it in or out, and it just had to do more with style, really, than technically vocal production.
Thank you. So a lot of the same but different. And I think in that same vein, we had a few questions about pitch. And I know that's a massive topic, but could you tell us, well, two questions here. William and Sophie on our chat were talking about pitch and wondering if there was a sense from an organ in our church in town to know how people in Williamsburg may have tuned their instruments. But if you could also just unpack that whole issue of changing pitch for folks in general, too.
I don't know about that. Anything about that? Do you know anything about pitch in Williamsburg?
Well, let's start in Europe, where because we are from England. There wasn't a pitch center in Europe like we have today, so things weren't standardized. In fact, an itinerant flutist would have a flute with up to 12 of these upper middle joints called cordes de rechange. Each one was a different length. That could change the length of the entire flute, changing the pitch center of the flute. So you could tune up with anybody you were with. So today we think of a lower pitch from modern 440, which keeps rising. So they're making modern flutes in 442 and even 444. So I know that flutes were imported here to the colonies. So I can only imagine that someone in Williamsburg in the 18th century playing the flute would have been playing at a lower pitch. We think of low pitch today as being, say, A432. Some instruments are even lower, like A415.
Well, the violin, of course, is a stringed instrument, so you can tune it anywhere, although it goes back to what I was saying about the earlier neck on the violin. The earlier style neck is nailed straight into the violin, so it's nailed on here. And technically, if you tuned it up too high, it could come off this way. Whereas the modern neck, the 19th century neck, is angled back, and it's mortised into the violin. So when you tune it up higher, it pulls itself into the violin. So the modern setup on a violin, it's much easier to tune it higher. And as far as the organ, I don't know. Maybe Danny knows something about the. Danny and Brady, of course, know about pitch, but I don't know about the organ in Williamsburg in the 18th century. Do you know anything?
There was an organ that was brought in by Cuthbert Ogle. So we know that was from London. So that's not necessarily definitive. Somebody from Bruton Parish might know more about how that organ was tuned, if it even survived. And sometimes they don't survive in good enough shape to really know. But from that, we can extrapolate that it was comparable to pitches in London at the time.
Well, thank you for going down that rabbit hole just a little bit for us. Sharon was curious about how were women musicians looked upon by society. What was and I'm sure it changes from over time and from place to place, but what are some of the things that you've come across, pro and against?
Well, there's one of the other women that we represented in our program last year. Well, the program that didn't happen last year, but over time. It was another Italian violinist named Madalena Lambardini, and she married another musician named Mr. Sierman, and she was known as Madame Sierman as a performer, and she was trained in the Ospedales, just like Anna Bon, but a different one, the Mendicante. But she had a career traveling, and she traveled to England and performed with J.C. Bach and Abel, and she was written about in the newspaper, and this little blurb about her playing was also published 3 months later after it appeared in London. This news about this female violinist appears in the Virginia Gazette, so that's very interesting. But they make all these comments about her playing the violin, saying it was most unusual to see a woman playing the violin, astonishing to see a woman playing the violin, and all things like that. So it was unusual in some circles to have a woman violinist. One evidence of that.
Well, and I know a lot of women in Europe in the 18th century were child prodigies, and many of them grew up in musical families. Richard Davies was a flutist in London. He had 2 daughters, and the first daughter was Cecile. She was an opera singer. The younger daughter was Marianne. She did a premiere concert at age 4, and she played a piece on Baroque flute that she wrote herself. She premiered Benjamin Franklin's glass harmonica and had a very successful performing career in London on that instrument. Her family toured all through Europe. They met the Glucks, the Mozarts, and they didn't end up very well, and the people around where they lived in Italy actually threw a benefit concert to help pay for their travel back home later in their lives. There are women who, they think in England there were quotes to the effect of the ladylike instruments and the not ladylike instruments. Oboe was very unladylike, and the flute, anything that you put up to your mouth, was considered unladylike, and they considered that the flute required too many of the juices that you would use in digestion. So they didn't really think that women were physically able to play these instruments like the men were in the 18th century. And this attitude that, we've got a woman who can really play, she can compose, and she's a woman. You even have things like that in the 19th century. Madame Szymanski comes through Virginia playing the modern flute with a troupe of people, and the ads in the newspaper allude to the same thing. We have a flutist from Europe, and she's a woman. So we're widely regarded as not as able as the men, and that lasted into the 20th century, well into the 20th century, with orchestras that were all male, and feeling like they had a special sound because there were no women in their ranks. So we've come a long way.
We mostly talked today about professional musicians in Europe, and certainly music making in America was largely an amateur affair. Tell us a little bit about the intersection of amateur music making and gender. I mean, How were women most often making music in America?
In their homes, privately, as far as,
And a lot of them
more
could be
about
quite good. One thing in Williamsburg that we discuss a lot is that there were a lot of very good amateurs. Thomas Jefferson. Well, some say Thomas Jefferson was very good. I think there's a quote about him being the worst violinist in Williamsburg except for Patrick Henry, which I think is a very interesting quote. I'm not sure if that's just, sour grapes on somebody's part, but a lot of the women amateurs were quite good, just as a lot of the men amateurs were quite good. It was considered unseemly to be a musician or an actor, which was also true in Europe. They certainly were not considered high society. Women, there were certainly fewer women instrumentalists on any kind of professional circuit. I don't know of any here in Williamsburg. Most of the singers were probably actresses that went with acting troupes. But that makes it sound a little bit like they might be like Broadway singers, but a lot of them were very serious singers and would give concerts strictly of music as a way to raise money as well. So it was just, they were sort of jack of all trades, and acting was one part of it. And a lot of them were quite good, but pretty much singers were the only professionals in this area.
How about with composition? Is there much amateur composition that survives? I'm sure some of this turns up, but certainly there's a difference between writing music for yourself and your close circle and then having it published. Do we find some of that showing up from the historical record in more recent years from women?
People kept in a setting of enjoying music with your family. People kept their own notebooks on dance tunes, so they would jot down dance tunes for themselves. But as far as women composing music and being
well, there was
known
Mariah
as
Causeway.
Mm-hmm.
Who was
in the colonies.
In the colonies, but she wrote for Thomas Jefferson, so there is a little bit of a connection there. Her songs are very pleasant, but she's not in the same league as the women we've been performing today. You had to get published, and being published as it is today, a lot of times just depends on the connections you have. If you have a family in the business, if you know people, if you're a friend of the king's, you are more likely to get published. That was true then, and unfortunately that's also true today.
Well, what about musical education for young women? How, in America in particular, how would a young woman in Williamsburg, let's say, learn to play or to sing or to read music?
Well, there were music teachers who advertised that they would come to your home to teach, or that they could teach young ladies to play English guitar or dancing. Again, in America, in this area, violin and flute are not mentioned as instruments that young ladies can play. But there was a woman who advertised in the Virginia Gazette that she could teach, Mrs. Neal. I don't know a whole lot about her, but do you guys know more about Mrs. Neal?
She taught guitar,
Mm-hmm.
but she did advertise also that she hired a tenor to give singing lessons to young ladies. So.
Young ladies were tutored in their own homes by musicians who traveled around and gave lessons in the home.
Right.
And
The family of Robert Carter, they had a dance master and a music master who regularly came around the house. However, the music master who came to their house didn't know how to play guitar, so Robert Carter himself taught his children how to play guitar. So you could learn from your parents as well as a music master.
some people possibly learned from each other and by ear when it comes to dance music, needing a dance fiddler. Many members of the enslaved community played dance music, played the violin. It's mentioned quite often in some of the ads in the newspapers of the enslaved community of people being very accomplished on the violin, being able to play a number of different kinds of music, probably mostly dance music, but they would either teach each other or learn from someone in the household how to play.
Well, I think we have time for one last question. You talked about and performed music from three really exceptional 18th century composers. I'm sure there are others. I'm sure our audience would love to hear about some. Maybe each of you could share tell us a little bit about another female composer from the 18th century who they should know more about, you might like to know more about, you look forward to performing their work in the future.
Yeah, well, I mentioned Mrs. Searman, Madame Searman, who was written about in London, and then the review of her performance made its way to Williamsburg and was in the Virginia Gazette here. She's quite notable in, she was really mostly known as a performer, but she did write music, and we've played some of her music. Probably not, say, on a level with Jacquet de la Guerre, but a very popular performer, and she studied with Francesco Gemignani, which is interesting because when she was at the Ospedale, not the Pietà but the Mendicante, she traveled to Padua to study with Francesco Gemignani, and then when she went back to school, he wrote her a letter which delineated how she should practice. And it's a very interesting letter, and it was republished by music historian and man about town Charles Burney in London. And he published that letter, so it begins, "My dear Madalena," and it's from the celebrated Francesco Gemignani, and he tells her how she should take the first sonata of Corelli's Opus 5, and he tells her how to go through it and how to change the bowings and how she should practice her bow. And it's a very interesting letter for getting clues about, things that you can, ways that you can practice to find your way into some techniques of playing 18th century music on the violin. It's very interesting. So I think she's my person, my other person.
Well, one area that I'm interested in, not so connected to Williamsburg, but it is colonial. There were a couple of nunneries in early Quebec. The one was St. Ursula. They were Ursuline nuns. The others escape me right now, but they were both in the city of Quebec, and from their collections come these collections of chants and some polyphonic music. It's beautifully done, and it is purely American in scope. It was written clearly after they came here. They didn't bring it with them, and it's just lovely music. It's written in the early, it sounds like French Baroque music, but it's also distinctly American. It's the beginning of Canadian music.
There was a young lady in London who played Viola De Gamba. She was second as a player only to Carl Friedrich Abel. And she actually wrote some of her own Viola Da Gamba pieces. Unfortunately, they did not survive. But she's a very interesting character because she decided to produce a concert series in London, which her father thought was very scandalous. So before opening night of the first series, he locked her in her room at home. And she was able to escape and ran off, and the show went on despite her father's efforts. That's Anne Ford Thickness. She played the lap guitar and the Viola Da Gamba.
Well, despite our pandemic, thank you all for making this show go on. Jenny, and Carol, Amy, Brady, and Daniel, wherever you are. Thank you so much for sharing this with us today, the knowledge and the talent. This program, of course, has been made possible by a generous grant from Ferguson Enterprises, and we're very grateful to them. To learn how you can support programs like this, please follow the link pinned to the comments below, or join us at colonialwilliamsburg.org. Do you all have any final thoughts to send us on our way?
Can't think of anything.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to very much thank you for joining us today for Trades Tuesdays, and we hope to see you here soon at Colonial Williamsburg at one of our music concerts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.